Hi, can everybody hear me? Yeah. Okay. I have a tendency to move away from the microphone, so if I do, just wave or something at me, and I'll rely on you. I suppose the first thing I want to say is just congratulations to SaOL, because it's just amazing to see so many people here today for an International Women's Day celebration, but also yesterday the idea that 76 voices were recorded for posterity, and I hope for again and again, and maybe it was good actually that we listened to it a few times, because perhaps we've been saying the same things for a very long period of time without those things being heard. So it was very good. I thought it was a performance piece, but it was very good. So I'm going to talk this afternoon at Gary's invitation, and thank you very much as well, Gary. I'm going to talk particularly about women and children, and women drug use in children. And I know for many people this is a really, really controversial and contentious issue. I've called it the presentation, Don't You Know That It's Different for Girls? Because I actually have been trying to draft something for a long period of time with that title. Gary said to me he didn't dare use the term girls, but I can. Because in fact some of the women, when I was asking them, was it different for girls, they actually sang Joe Jackson's song, you know, the Don't You Know That It's Different for Girls. I'm not going to sing it. But of course his song goes on to say, you're all the same. And of course, we're not all the same. You know, we're not a homogenous group. We're a very diverse group. And of course, women who use drugs, or women who are in recovery, or women who are on methadone, stable, unstable, whatever, are a very diverse group. So from that point of view, anyway, I'm going to just look at difference for a few minutes, and then I'm going to just try and not talk for too long. And again, we can have some questions and answers afterwards if I don't go on too long. So the aims of the presentation really are to highlight issues with regard to women and drug use, childcare, motherhood and parenting. And I'm kind of drawing on an overview really, bringing a lot of ideas together from probably a lot of literature that I've come in contact with over a long period of time. And also I'm drawing on a very large research project that I actually carried out myself here in Dublin over a long period of time on the experiences of women drug users at different stages of their drug using and their motherhood careers. And I then would like to conclude by exploring some of the pertinent policy issues and the practice concerns and the challenges that are there for us in relation to this particular issue, because it is a really thorny issue. And I suppose I do have to say that at many levels, I suppose, and I've been accused of this before, I really will always put myself on the side of the angels. And in this case, in many ways, it's on the side of what are very often people who are assumed to be fallen angels. So from that point of view, I'll state my sort of position at the outset, while also saying that it's very, very difficult, and these issues are extremely difficult, and they do bring up a lot of concerns for us as practitioners and the like. Bad, sad, or mad is an idea I've used quite a lot in teaching in the past, and one of the people actually I know quite well, Betsy Thom, she talked about the fact that many stereotypes exist about drug using women, and they're either viewed as bad because they use drugs or alcohol in the first place, because women, girls, were supposed to be good girls, and we're supposed to be sugar, spice, and all things nice. And basically, when women use drugs, they are perceived in more negative terms than men. We're sad because we're victims of circumstance and dependence on the men in their lives, or they're constructed as mad, worse than male drug users, because nothing can be done to help them, and their prognosis is bad. Betsy was putting it up to people by using those terms and those words, but basically she's suggesting that there's many stereotypes that exist about drug using women. So, women and difference. What do we know about women drug users? We talk a lot about difference, and we have to ask the question, I suppose, is being a drug user, is doing drugs, having the identity of the master status of being a drug user, being a family member as a drug user, engaging with services, interacting with the criminal justice system, is it different for women? And I suppose in terms of most of the own research, when I asked the question, is it different for girls, there was a resounding yes from all of the women I interviewed and all of the professional workers who I interviewed, and family members as well. The difference is just across the board. But the one key thing that came up was the difference in relation to children childcare, motherhood, and the difference between mothering and fathering, and also the fact that the gendered nature really of the fact that women very often and most often are the primary caregivers in a situation. So if we're talking about working with drug using parents, we're generally talking about drug using mothers. And we have to really face the right reality of that. We kind of degender it, or we kind of say, oh, we're working with drug using parents, but it is mostly women. Now, having said that, there's a lot of work being done also on drug use and fatherhood that's really interesting, but that's for another day. So I'm sure we'll come back to that at some stage, and it is interesting stuff. But women and difference, qualitative differences. Initiation into use is different for women. Loads of research shows that. The drug use career itself is different for women. The pathways into addiction is different for women. Addiction career itself is different. Treatment seeking, how women seek treatment, why they seek treatment, when they seek treatment is different. And there are many obstacles and barriers to women coming into treatment. And just listening to the 76 voices, they were all there. I thought, God, I don't have to speak. Don't have to, because so much of the obstacles and barriers in terms of childcare and a whole range of other things were raised there. The drug treatment career is different as well. Women have different relationships with services. They're brought into different services for different reasons. They're dealt with in different ways. Recovery experiences are different. Some women say that it is extremely difficult, years and years and years and years after they've left a drug career behind, to actually leave some of the stigma that attaches. And particularly for women, it's harder again. And of course, in relation to parenting, there's a significant difference. So just wanted to quote the words of, or just use the words of one of the people who I interviewed, an addiction counsellor, in a research project I did. And he, because it was a man, said, I do think that their experience is different from men's. But I'm not sure that that's because they're drug users. I think it's because they're women. I think that's the differences then can be drawn from the fact that already women in those communities are not on an equal footing with men. So while I thought it was a really important quote, because it did sort of suggest that, in fact, most Irish women drug users probably have a lot of similarities with other Irish women just generally, and our experiences in society generally. However, I think it's really important to point out that in terms of the difference between Irish women who have issues with drug and alcohol use and Irish women who don't, the big key issue is in relation to being a mother. Because a lot of the time people will say, oh, well, in fact, it almost appears from our constitution that to be a woman in Ireland you have to be a mother. Because in fact we still have clauses in the constitution that say that very clearly. But this is one group of women who are not seen as being kind of natural mothers or having a God-given right to be a mother. So from that point of view, in fact, many drug-using women are quite different from other Irish women who are, at the moment anyway, in the Constitution, it sort of says that women and motherhood is interchangeable. So just in terms of difference, I think it's important just to look at that. In terms of women and pleasure, again, very difficult, thorny issue, even in 2013. But certainly when it comes to taking pleasure in either alcohol or illicit drugs, I really like this quote because it does raise the issue of the fact that taking pleasure in alcohol or drugs, and we know that more and more women are certainly taking pleasure in terms of alcohol. We've seen differences in terms of maybe drug use over time, but certainly in terms of alcohol use, it can exclude us from our established roles of carer and moral judge. And in some commentaries talk about women as being God's police, that they police men, they keep men in line, so we have to behave ourselves to at least keep the guys well behaved. And, I'm sure even in the drug using community, one of the things that some of the women have said to me over time was, I never got to use as much as he did. I wouldn't have got my hands on as much. I didn't get as big a slice of the pie, even when it came to the amount of drugs I got to use. I might have put in the same amount of effort to raise the money to get the drugs. I might have done a whole range of things the same, but I didn't actually get the same amount. So we do see differences in that. But the other thing that is suggested is that the women who use drugs and alcohol are not proper women. They're not nice women. And yet we know that really in the 19th century, in Victorian times, nice women did campaign against rum while they were taking opium-laced tonics, which were prescribed substances, and then their great-granddaughters have been able to find their femininity in campaigning against alcohol and opium and in dutifully taking tranquilizers. So this big thorny issue about women and drugs, women and prescription drugs, women and pleasure is always there. So I just wanted to show you this, because I don't know whether people have seen some of the women's temperance movements, but this is my motto: lips that touch liquor shall never touch mine. But it's the idea that the woman is pure, and we're policing the men, we're keeping them in line. So if you're into the liquor yourself, you're in trouble. And this one is great as well, because this one is actually men dressed as women, I hasten to say. Just in case you're wondering. Because one of my very rude male colleagues suggested that wouldn't be much of a deterrent. But actually I pointed out to them that it is a men's group. It's a men's theatre group from the 1930s, and it says, lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours. But those sort of women's temperance messages are the sorts of messages that are always there in the background. So to bring us to some of the words that the women and workers said to me in my research, one woman said, and she was somebody I met during field work, I didn't actually interview her for a very lengthy period of time, and she said to me, being a mother is the best thing I've ever done, and it's the most important thing I'm going to do in my life. But I'm afraid a lot that I lose them, she means her children, because I'm an addict. But I've lasted till now, but I know I've survived it all. The kids, they're so great. Being a mother, there's nothing else. And I think for a lot of women, that is the key thing, whether their children are with them or not. Their motherhood identity, their children, their being involved with their children is the central issue in their lives. Now, one of the social workers I interviewed said, I think that women, and she was talking more generally than just drug-using women, but she was specifically mentioned drug-using women. She said, I think women get a harder time. I think once they come to the attention of services and drug services, we have ideas as how women ought to behave in our society. And if they slip from that, from being like the Virgin Mary, they're gone. They're like the Mary Magdalens, aren't they? There was loads of these sort of religious images all through my research findings. So it really struck me as something very strong, that basically we were under great pressure to be a certain type of woman in society a lot of the time. And even now in 2013, that's the case. Another woman said to me, if a woman with kids asked me what she should do, I'd say keep it hidden. Try and detox yourself, stay away from services, keep mum about your drug use. I know that sounds irresponsible of me and me in recovery and drug-free, but I only escaped and kept my kids by the skin of my teeth. And that was a woman named Andrea. These are all pseudonyms, just in case you're wondering. I've given people, or they took or chose extra or new names. But that woman gave me a title for my thesis, which was Keeping Mum, Keeping Quiet, Keeping Mum in order to keep your motherhood role. And that's what a lot of the women were saying to me, that they felt they might be under pressure to do. So I just want to go for a little bit and just look. Am I okay time-wise, Gary? I'm not going on too long. I just wanted to look a little bit at research and commentaries in relation to the thorny issues, in relation to children and childcare and child protection and child welfare, because this is becoming a major issue, I think, and certainly from early studies I did to more recent studies, I've seen that this is a big issue. And of course, I'm now back at the front line with a practice involvement in some of these issues as well. Research and commentaries focus really on a very broad range of issues, and these can be as diverse as the impact of parental drug use on child development. So if you're going through some of the literature, the effects of drug use on parenting capacity and the capacity of parents to actually parent their children, the effects of drug use now on parenting capacity. Parenting styles of drug-using parents. There's been quite a bit of literature about different parenting styles. Child abuse or child maltreatment, as they call it in the United States, among children of drug-using parents. And then the issues and dilemmas. And a lot of that work has happened, particularly in the United States and in the UK as well. I suppose more recently, there's been quite a lot of emphasis in America and in England, Scotland, Wales, in relation to the issues and dilemmas, and here in Ireland as well, for drug treatment and social work personnel. And I suppose that's where we come in an awful lot of the time. And the other area that there's been quite a lot of work on has been assessing risk in relation to parenting with drug-using parents. So that's where, it's a very, very diverse area, enormous literature. quite conflicting and contradictory, and there's a lot of different methodological issues that could be raised with a lot of the stuff, but some of it is quite harrowing to read, some of it's quite concerning and worrying, depending on, some of the research that's carried out in the States is affected by the war on drugs mentality that goes on in the United States, and the way, I suppose, families are constructed and the way families are perceived, and also the way children very often end up within the alternative care system quite quickly. There isn't the strong family preservation, or the stronger, I should say, family preservation model that might operate here in Europe. So from that point of view, I think it's important to say that there's a different tone for an awful lot of the research and an awful lot of the findings. So how do you come to final conclusions about all this sort of enormous amount of research, and it's so contradictory at times. Research findings, there seems to be a consensus, and I suppose a lot of people here today are practitioners and people who may have had experience themselves with alcohol and drugs in the past or currently or whatever. There's a consensus certainly among practitioners, and there's a consensus in a lot of the research that confirms that parental drug use, whether it's by a father or a mother, or by both parents, will present a range of challenges for parents, obviously, for children, obviously, and for the practitioners who work for them. Many in contact with researchers and services are those who are experiencing a range of different difficulties, a range of adversity, or multiple environmental risk factors. They're often overlapping. So, you have poverty, deprivation, early school leaving, violence, homelessness and mental health challenges, loads of it came up earlier, imprisonment and social exclusion generally. And I think one of the things that I found really when I was doing my research, and a lot of the time when we've been working in the field, that really it's just day-to-day basic survival for an awful lot of people a lot of the time. It's like drugs, alcohol, HIV, just like where's the dinner coming from? The food has to be on the table, the kids have to be got from school. Those are the sorts of things that are coming up for people, just basic survival. When we talk about drug-using parents, as I said earlier, the parents in question are almost always mothers. In families where drug use is an issue, often the main carer using drugs is also a single parent, or if not a single parent on a full-time basis, is certainly intermittently a single parent and is alone. Children of drug-using parents are often seen or constructed as being in grave risk as a result of their parents' involvement in drug taking, and sometimes there is this view that children are going to be much safer if they're elsewhere, if they're away from their parents or whatever. And in certain cases, children do have to be away from their parents, but it is important, I suppose, that we are careful in terms of how we can construct these risks and the like, because the risk of separation and the risk of preventing a child from seeing a parent on an ongoing basis or whatever because of drug use or whatever is also quite considerable. So I think we have to look in the long term at what these things might mean. Children of drug using parents are often claimed to be invisible. And the levels of denial and secrecy among parents and their children and family networks, and the isolation, often due to stigma and shame, have been identified by a large range of researchers. So this is really kind of predominantly what the research findings are saying. The impact of parental drug use, particularly maternal drug use, may have on children is very broad. I mean, it can range from the situation where parents are unable to provide consistent care to, on the other hand, the risks that a child will lose a parent as a result of death, or there will be parent-child separations. So there's a very broad range of risks. Parental drug use may impact on, and I always say may impact because you can't automatically say will impact. And an awful lot of people say it will impact in this way. We don't know, and a lot of the time it doesn't, and we have to assess and we have to look at every case differently and really be fair and not to make generalisations. So it may impact on children in a number of ways. The potential impacts can range from children's exposure to drug use in utero during pregnancy, withdrawals, or when through neonatal abstinence syndrome. There has been reported higher risk of mortality, prematurity, low birth weights in some case, and then there have been studies that have looked at developmental and behavioural issues that arise in among children who've experienced, say, drug and alcohol use. There have been reports about abuse and neglect and substance abuse problems in adulthood as well. So it's quite varied, and this is, again, I'm just really condensing an awful lot of the research findings into an overview. The other thing that a lot of the research has shown is that the stigma associated with problematic use of an illicit drug and the activities associated with its procurement may somewhat exacerbate the difficulties for parents and children as well. The interesting thing is that even in interactions with social workers, there's been quite a lot of recent research done that shows the difference between how social workers respond to parents who arrive into their offices or who whatever with alcohol difficulties, and on the other hand parents who have drug problems. So there definitely is a difference in the way drug users, illicit drug users are perceived. So all in all, really, it looks like that in the main, drugs and babies are I'm not saying they're lethal mix, by the way, before anybody shoots me. They are constructed as being a lethal mix. And I suppose I just wanted to put this quote up because Patricia Kearney, the woman who said these words 20 years ago now, she said them in 1993, about May 1993, in a conference that some of us held in Trinity in relation to childcare issues. And she raised the question, why does the combination of drugs and children raise such enormous anxiety in us? And 20 years later, of course, almost 20 years later, it's still doing the same. The values we attach to parenting affect us professionally. And that's what we have to remember all the time. Our personal views and our prejudices and our beliefs come into the workplace with us, and we have to be constantly looking at that issue. The image then of the bad mother, and again in inverted commas, is a terrible, unspeakable notion. And a mother using drugs is a clash of values affecting society's sense of emotional and moral security. And I don't think that has really changed in 20 years. That feeling is there. In fact, sometimes I think it's even more intense, and that there's less sympathy and less tolerance towards women in that situation now. So I also, at the same conference that Patricia Kearney spoke, I spoke as well. And I was director of Anna Liffey Drug Project at the time, in my younger days, and it was published along with Patricia's article in 1994 in the Irish Social Worker. And I just literally, it was a snapshot survey of the 186 women who had attended the project during 1992. And because we wanted to see, well, how many mothers were there? You know, what sort of services were necessary, etc., etc. 142 women were mothers. 44 hadn't had children yet at that stage. And many of the 44 women who were at that time childless went on to have children, so it became mothers later. And I know because I met them in other sort of situations years later in different ways. So collectively the 142 women had 280 children, so a lot of children. And it really needed to be, you know, sort of stated that this is, I mean, it is a central issue for women. And we had, I suppose, at that time about a third of the people who were attending the project were women, and that was an improvement on earlier times when there were fewer women coming in, and a lot of anxiety among staff when children did come in the late 80s. So from that point of view, if you're going to welcome if you're going to welcome women to a project, you have to provide supports, and you have to provide supports around a whole range of issues in relation to children, because when women come, the children will come too. So from that point of view, I also looked at the time of the research, I also looked at where the children were living. And again, it was a snapshot. 63% of the women were actually caring for their own children. 26 women had children living with family members. 9 women had children in foster care or residential care, and 18 women had children in combinations of the above. So it was quite interesting for me to find that 63% actually had children in their care. Just providing a snapshot of where I am now. I'm team leader in the Rye Alto Community Drug Team, back in the front line, and basically we have a attendance at the service of about almost 40% are women. Now, they're not all drug using women. There may be non-drug using women who are family members and the like, but in terms of our methadone prescribing clinics that take place, we have 46 men attend and 32 women, so it's a little over 40% of our women. So I was really pleased with that when I realised there were so many women and children attending the centre, and that's really good. Of the 57 children who are currently in contact with the centre, with the service, 17 are living with carers other than parents. 15 are being cared for by family members, while 2 are in the care of alternative carers outside of their kinship system. So we do see that there's a good possibility that children may be in a situation, or parents may be in a situation, where they will have to experience the children being cared for by alternative carers, either in their family system or beyond their family system. And we need to actually take this into consideration in terms of access and support and the like as well. My study, am I okay time-wise? Yeah, okay. My study in the interim, when I was in the Ivory Tower, but kind of escaping onto the streets of Dublin, trying to do an ethnography to get away from the university, I carried out a very big study. And during that study, I met 205 women on the street, basically, some of whom I interviewed and some of whom participated in focus groups that I facilitated or conducted. And I also interviewed and met with 100 professional workers and a number of family members and several adult children of women participants. So I carried out interviews with 26 women, a series of in-depth interviews. It wasn't just one interview, it was a number of different interviews and focus groups, participant observation, and then there were semi-structured interviews with 40 professional workers in the drug treatment field, in the nursing, medical and social work, community work. Of the people that I met, 193 of the 205 women were mothers, so that was even greater than in the earlier time when I was in Alifi, and there was 144 out of the 186. 193 of the 205 women were mothers, and of the 12 women who weren't mothers, they intended to become mothers at some stage. Motherhood was absolutely central to their lives. So again, we were talking about the 76 women's voices earlier. I mean, that's what I tried to do, is to actually access the women's voices in the study that I did. And it became very clear to me was that, and in terms of the research I did and also in terms of the literature, that women who use illicit drugs really are culturally portrayed in negative stereotypical terms, and they're seen as unfeminine very often, you know, inverted commas, unclean and immoral. But when it comes to drug using and motherhood, when the stereotype really is expanded to describe a person who, in society's view, invariably gives priority to drug use rather than her children, then it becomes much more extreme and much more difficult. So just some of the women, one or two of the women loads of the women said loads of things to me, but I've just taken a few quotes. One woman said, "It's a man's world anyway, isn't it? So they think men can do what they like. There's no equality at all." I was conscious of the fact that it was International Women's Day. I was focusing on a few things in relation to equality when I was selecting some of the things to say. And then another woman, and again these are pseudonyms, said, "I think life is less fairer for women than for men. I think men have an awful lot handier in every aspect." And she responded, and was very interesting. She said, "Thank God I have a son." She didn't want to be raising a daughter, which was, I thought, really interesting thing, and she made that very clear in her interview. One community worker said, women, they have to prove themselves twice as good in a way that nobody else is judged because of the bias and perception. So you're always starting. You're already, at a disadvantage starting out, and that was said by one community worker. Another community worker said very clearly, "I'd hate to be out there now with an addiction, proving myself, parenting in public, proving myself in public, night, noon, and morning." So the parenting issue is major, and then. Another social worker said there are huge gendered expectations of the women as mothers, as primary caretakers. The women get the abuse from the system because you're not minding your kids. But nobody goes to the fathers and says, "Well, you're not minding your kids." You have that whole scenario where the man is saying, "Well, there's nothing wrong with me, it's her. She's their mother and she's on drugs." So there's quite a lot of difference that comes up in the accounts that are given by both professional workers and women. There's a big emphasis on the difference between women and the difference between men and women. So the women and the children, just to say, 190, as I said, 93 of the women were mothers, and they were collectively mothers of 442 living children. And they ranged in ages from infancy to independence and adulthood. And some of the women were grandmothers as well at this stage in their lives. And some of them were actually caring for other people's children as well. And I met a number who were pregnant at that stage. I suppose one of the key things for me was that an awful lot of the women, and I kind of, am I okay time-wise? Yeah. An awful lot of, how many? Oh my God. Okay. An awful lot of the women had a lot of difficulties. People will have access to this later, so I'll kind of skip over a little bit of it. Had a lot of difficulties in preserving their motherhood role, and a significant number during the time that I was researching. I came in contact with a lot of women who lost their children into the care of others. either temporarily or in the longer term. So about 15 of the 26 interviewees, which was almost 60%, more than 60% of the women I met in focus groups, and a loosely estimated sort of 60% of the 123 mothers that I met during observation had lost their children to the care of others for various periods. Some women had lost total contact with all of their children. Some managed to retrieve their children into their care, and that was brilliant. But it is a significant, sort of evidence of motherhood really interrupted. So in terms of the living arrangements, I'll leave you to have a look at that on the website eventually. Significant numbers of the women that I had contact with were also in contact with social services. There's just a few key things that I think really need to be said. Some of the beliefs that are held by the women in relation to the fact that if you are in contact with services, you might be at risk of losing your children into care. They're after my kids. They only want to treat me because I am a mother. They want to keep an eye on me. Those sort of notions and ideas and beliefs that are held by the women participants, they may lead to their avoidance of services or refusing family support or refusing to let people know when they need help, concealing their drug using status or concealing their relapses or concealing their difficulties, or at least minimising their involvement with drug use in order to preserve their role. And I'm a very strong harm reduction advocate, and I strongly believe that you don't necessarily need to be absolutely drug free, you don't need to be absolutely pure as the driven snow to be a good enough parent. Parenting capacity does not necessarily depend on the amount or the drug consumed. And I think as a result, this sort of notion that we put out there is really anathema to the notion of harm reduction or the reduction of drug-related harm, particularly during pregnancy. Because if women aren't going to come in during pregnancy and they're not going to get the care and they're not going to get the care and the treatment, that's going to have a long-term, impact. And in terms of parenting, women may need a lot of supports. So in terms of I suppose, some of the beliefs that we do need to take those on board, they are there, those fears are there. And also in terms of professional workers, there are always a small minority of professional workers who perceive drug use and parenting as incompatible and mutually exclusive activities. Now, for some, that does become the case. There's no doubt about it. But I think the vast majority of people I've come in contact believe that drug use per se does not necessarily impact on the ability to be a good enough parent. But there's always the but. It nearly always is followed by a but. So there are people who totally do not believe that they really do not believe that drug use and parenting can go together. Others are pessimistic, others are pragmatic about the area. But it's a really difficult station for a woman drug user to be in, to be parenting in contact with the service, and for there to be concerns about her capacity to parent. Involvement in child welfare and protection is quite high. We've evidence from America, evidence from England, Scotland and Wales, and we've also got small amount of evidence here in Ireland from small Irish studies that have been carried out. So the issues then for drug treatment professionals and social workers and working with drug using parents really that have been in the international literature, and I suppose things that came up in interview with me when I was talking to people over time. Challenges with regard to assumptions and attitudes, what we think, what we bring to work, what we believe. Knowledge about drugs and substance use issues. Realistically speaking, there's still a big divide. Drugs workers are very uneasy about dealing with childcare issues or dealing with women and childcare issues. And very often social workers do not know enough about drugs and substance use issues. And I say that as somebody who's worked very closely with social workers who've known a lot and known very little. And I also say that as somebody who's been involved with educating social workers in one of the colleges here. But, the very small piece on addiction that is part of a 4-year social work programme, it's a tiny, tiny piece that's part of that programme. And yet, there are most students coming back from placement, and most social workers are saying that their caseloads have significant amounts of alcohol and drug use related cases in their caseloads. So from that point of view, knowledge about drugs and substance use issues has to be constantly worked on, both at the sort of formative education and later in relation to continuing professional development. Engagement with drug-using parents is always a challenge because it is difficult. If you're in a voluntary sector or community sector agency, it can be much easier to engage with drug-using parents. Assessment is also a major issue, confidentiality, and also interagency cooperation. Adult-child services trying to communicate, or in my case and other services where you have a childcare part of the service and an adult part of the service. And the dialogue and the difficulties that can occur there between different positions that may arise. And of course, gaining access to children's perspectives and views, because in research we're not doing it because of the ethical concerns, and we don't always do it in court or when we're talking to children about what they want about their future and the like. So the implications for policy and practice, and I swear to God I'll finish then. Women's issues and children's issues, I think, I don't know really what to think, and I think it'd be interesting to hear what people have to say afterwards. It's 24 years actually to the month since I walked into the Anna Liffey Drug Project and started working there. And sometimes I think, well, it's brilliant, there's SaOL, and it's brilliant, there's lots of things. And, I just heard today that the new director or chief executive of Cool Mine is a woman. So which is fantastic. So there's lots of things have changed over time. But have things really changed on the ground? I think in some ways it's harder now. And perhaps there's more children being separated. More children are going into alternative care situations. We are actually taking on board less and less the fact that there may be some drug use that we have to take on board in the cases and the situations that we're working with. Children's issues are central as well. Services need to be family focused. We need to be very aware of the impact of separations on children. Children always want to return to where they came from as adults, no matter where they've come from or what they've come from. If you talk to children who've left care, the anger they feel very often about the separations, even where they have been taken out of situations that seem to us all to be untenable. We really need to look at the impact of separations and the importance of access and all sorts of work with families when those separations do occur. Adversarial perspectives. They don't necessarily have a value, but this is a very adversarial area, and I think it's becoming more adversarial. And one of the things that we've been doing in the project where I'm now working is we have a solicitor present about once every 2 weeks. And issues around childcare and issues around concerns that parents are having are getting to the solicitor's desk, and people are beginning to ask questions. Because if it's been played in an adversarial way, we may have to support women to actually be more adversarial in response as well. Interagency responses, multidisciplinary cooperation, I'm not sure it's any further on despite all the work that's been done in terms of how different agencies communicate with each other around these issues. So even all this time ahead. The importance of assessment and a framework that includes guidelines about drug use that are not just tick boxes, but that are about actually looking at the process and looking at the impact of drug use in people's lives, and then looking at, is it affecting parenting? Is it affecting parenting capacity? Those sort of things are really important. Keeping child welfare at the centre of things. Keeping child protection issues there too. We need to know about children first. We need to know about all the legislative changes that come about, and we need to be aware of the importance of child protection and respond where it is necessary. But the whole idea of family preservation and strengthening where it is possible, we need to be really clued into that. And the other thing I think is that some of the American literature has said it, and some of the literature I think here and in England has said it too. Poverty and social exclusion affect children dramatically, and in many cases sometimes it's hard to actually really work out what is the difficulty here, what is affecting children the most. And we have to recognise that even, and now I suppose in another session, we have to recognise the impact of poverty and social exclusion on families and women and children, and housing and homelessness as well, which is another day's work that I'm not even going to go into at this stage. So I suppose just in conclusion, and I'm sorry, Gary, I'm sure I've gone on more than 2 minutes, just a process of trial and error. Patricia Kearney, when she came here to Dublin 20 years ago, she said work with drug-using parents, and she really was talking about drug-using women, drug-using mothers, and their children has always been a difficult and sensitive area of practice. It still is. And she said then it's been a process of trial and error. And I think probably we need to ask the question, is it still a process of trial and error? So I'll conclude there and hope that maybe people will ask a few questions.